looking at today's Daily Kos, Joan McCarter talking about how Ben Carson, genius, can't name a single country he would call on to help in the fight against terrorism. Right. Donald Trump says he'd consider shutting down mosques to fight terrorism. Mitt Romney calls for another ground war in the Middle East because they go so well, you know? Laura Clausen writing over at the Daily Kos. And then President Obama, we must continue to accept refugees. Republican presidential candidates use their big frontal lobes to call for fear of Syrian refugees. This is my concern. Is that, you know, we've been being played. Osama Bin Laden came right out and said in 1998 that he was going to play us. That he was going to attack us in such a big and spectacular way that if we had a president who was an idiot and would overreact, that he, Osama bin Laden, would become, you know, the powerful guy. Keep in mind, this, you know, in 98, Osama bin Laden was largely unknown to anybody outside of the intelligence community. He had been kicked out of his own country, Saudi Arabia. He had been banished. His passport had been taken because after we paid him to help throw the Russians out of Afghanistan, and he was successful in doing that, we funded the Mujahideen. We helped create Al-Qaeda. We helped create Osama bin Laden's organization. After we did that, he went back to Saudi Arabia, and now he was like full of, you know, spit and vinegar. And boy, have I had a success. You know, I'm a tough guy. And what's next? Well, what was next in his mind was Iraq. Now, I realize I had a sadly misguided, obviously Fox News, so-called news viewer call in the last hour who just was totally, hopelessly lost about this. But, you know, it's probably worth explaining that Iraq at that time, here you've got Osama bin Laden sitting in Saudi Arabia, and he's looking at the next country over, right? They share a border, Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And he's really upset about two things. He's upset about the fact that the United States, still has a military base in Saudi Arabia. Now, he considers, being a good Salafite, he considers the land of Saudi Arabia from border to border to be sacred to Islam. And therefore, our having a military base there where women are showing their elbows and drinking alcohol and consorting with men and driving, God forbid, and voting, and men are watching pornography and drinking alcohol, he considered that extreme blasphemy. So he wanted to rid Saudi Arabia of the U.S. Air Force Base. George W. Bush finally figured that out, even though bin Laden told us in 1998 very clearly. George W. Bush finally figured it out, and in 2005, he closed our Air Force Base there. Bush gave in to bin Laden after he failed to catch him. Like, please don't hit us again, or something like that. So bin Laden then says, okay, you know, he wasn't going to have any success, you know, trying to take out our Air Force Base. So what's the other thing that he's really upset about? The other thing he was really upset about was Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the next country over, because Saddam Hussein was not imposing Islam on his people the way that Osama bin Laden liked that the Saudis were doing. Osama bin Laden was not a Wahhabist. He was a Sunni, but he was not a Wahhabist. He was not a Salafite. He was not one of these fundamentalist, you know, he wasn't the Muslim equivalent of a Mike Huckabee. He wasn't one of these guys who wants to impose his religion on everybody through the instrument of the state. And so in Iraq, women could go to college, they could go to school, they could have any job they wanted, they could drive, they could vote. Women had rights. And this was intolerable to Osama bin Laden. So he gathered together a couple thousand of his guys in Saudi Arabia, and they went to the border with Iraq to try to provoke a war between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, knowing that Saudi Arabia had the third largest military in the world. He thought he could convince the king of Saudi Arabia, if he could provoke Saddam Hussein to lob a few missiles across the border into Saudi Arabia, if he could really, really piss off Saddam Hussein, then, and Hussein threw a couple of missiles into Saudi Arabia, then Saudi Arabia would respond and you'd have a full-blown war. And in Osama bin Laden's mind, that infidel Saddam Hussein could be taken down. So bin Laden hated Saddam Hussein. And, one of his goals was to end all of these secular dictatorships or secular governments in the Middle East. Hussein was one of them. Another one that he hated was Syria, Assad in Syria, who was an Alawite, which is, close enough to a Shia that he hated that. And he said basically to us, I'm going to make you so freaked out that you're going to do what I want. Assuming that you've got a village idiot in the White House. Now, I can't say that Al Gore and Lieberman would have responded that much differently. I don't know. I think Al Gore might have been more measured. I do not think that Joe Lieberman would have been. I thought Joe Lieberman was a terrible choice for vice president. I mean, with a capital T, in fact, all caps. And he probably would have made the same mistake that George W. Bush did. But, Osama bin Laden hit us on 9/11, and our response to that was to go after Afghanistan, which had nothing to do with 9/11. It was Osama bin Laden's thing. It wasn't Afghanistan's thing. That was just the Taliban. In fact, the Taliban was willing to arrest bin Laden and hand him over to us. As they had done with the opium guys, opium was a major crop in Afghanistan in 2001. And George W. Bush, this was in March of 2001, before 9/11, George W. Bush gave them some either $24 or $42 million and said, here, pass this out to your opium growers and tell them to burn their fields. And they did. And worldwide opium production, or the Afghan opium production went from around 8 to 10 million I don't know if it was pounds or tons, but 8 to 10 million a year, down to around 2. And the price of heroin went up around the world, and heroin addiction went down, and disease went down. And it was a good thing for Europe. It was a good thing for Russia. It was a good thing for us. But, Osama bin Laden was convinced that he could make George W. Bush behave in a crazy fashion and make the Middle East hate us. And he was right. Are we going to make the same mistake? Isn't it time for the countries in the region, the Muslim countries in the region, who are genuinely threatened by Daesh, by ISIL, who are generally threatened by these guys, doesn't it make sense that they should be fighting them? Especially Saudi Arabia, with the third largest military in the world? And this is all happening right next door to them? And that's what Bernie Sanders is suggesting, and I think it's very smart. But, boy, if Hollande, the pressure's got to be on Francois Hollande right now. It's got to be so intense. And, the first thing that I said to Louise after that attack on Friday night was Marie Le Pen is going to be the next president of France. And I hope not. She's the French equivalent of kind of Pat Buchanan. I hope that's not the case. She's actually probably more the French equivalent of the KKK,
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
She's a respectable David Duke. But to watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.